C'est moins simple. Mais tu sais, quand tu as des leaderships, c'est pas ça n'a jamais merci. I don't know, maybe yes, or maybe actually in this case it's les gens ne savent pas où et on ne sait pas aussi. C'est la même
Shall I just kick off? So, yeah.
Hi everyone, so you're going to let Roger start.
Hi folks, I'm going to do two talks today. The first one is kind of general talk about the ecology of seamounts, a type of habitat which I've been working on and off since 1994, dare I say, probably before some of you were born. And then I'm going to give a second talk today on Ocean Census, which is a new program on discovering species funded by the Nippon Foundation. So I thought I'd start with the obvious question of what is a seamount? Well, it's basically an elevation from the seafloor with a limited extent across the summit. It's completely submerged. Seamounts are different from islands and even the oceanic islands, although in terms of ecology, they do share some features, as you might know if you've ever dived on both ecosystems. The strict geological definition suggests that they have to have a minimum elevation of about 1,000 meters, although knolls and hills, which are much shorter structures, if you like, between 1,200 meters in elevation and 200 meters and below, share many features of ecology with seamounts. So in the literature, actually all these structures are often referred to as seamounts. And this is the UK's only seamount, I would say, or nearly only seamount, the Anton Dawn seamount from the west of Scotland, which we were working on in 2016, I think. So another thing I wanted to start off by saying is that seamounts are incredibly common features of the seafloor. And this is from a paper we did back in 2011 with Chris Yessen, where we used satellite gravity mapping, satellite bathymetry, to look at the number of seamounts across the seafloor. And we estimated there are over 33,000 seamounts of more than 1,000 meters elevation in the ocean, covering about 4.7% of the seafloor. If you consider smaller features, so knolls, which are between 200 to 1,000 meters in elevation, then we're dealing with over 138,000 features on the seafloor, covering about 16.3% of the ocean floor. So there are lots and lots of these features throughout the ocean. And indeed, if we look at seamounts as a habitat globally, and indeed compare them to some of the terrestrial and shallow water marine ecosystems we're familiar with, we find that seamounts have an area of about 17 million square kilometres, the continental shelves about 24 million, and then things like tropical humid forest, about 10 million square kilometres, and temperate broadleaf forest, about 11 million square kilometres. So in fact, on global terms, seamounts are significant ecosystems on Earth. Just put in some nice pictures of corals to tempt you all. So why are seamounts of importance in terms of biodiversity and conservation? Well, they're important habitats for many oceanic predators. So these are things like whales, sharks, large teleos such as tuna and billfish, cephalopods, particularly oceanic squid, but also some of the animals which associate with the seafloor like octopods and cuttlefish, seals, turtles and seabirds have all been found to forage preferentially around seamounts, and some of these animals, particularly turtles, are thought to actually use seamounts as navigational waypoints in their transoceanic migrations. Seabirds are thought to be able to find some seamounts because of the smell of DMS associated with them, because of elevated primary production around these habitats. It's not just pelagic predators that are found in high concentrations around seamounts, but also certain species of demersal or bentho pelagic fish. And these are typically sort of lay in wait or ambush predators, or species which live close to the seafloor and mainly feed on micronectin. So these are animals like coffin fish, chornax species, which we often see on seamounts and also actually on the slopes of tropical oceanic islands, scorpion fish, oreos, roughies, and alfonsinos. And of course, some of these species are fished commercially, particularly the species on the bottom row here, but also scorpions as well. And of course, seamounts also host very rich benthic communities as well. This is actually a photograph from the Anton Dorn seamount from about 400 meters. And you can see this really rich Lophelia pertusa reef living on the seamount. But seamounts also host a wide range of other hard substrata benthic invertebrates, sponges, corals, black corals, and many others. But it's important to remember that seamounts are not just about rocky habitat. They also can sometimes have a lot of soft substrates associated with them, particularly deeper seamounts, or these gravels or pavement-like areas where you have rock which is overlain by quite a thin layer of sediment. So seamounts do have quite a wide variety of different habitats for marine invertebrates. I thought this might be an issue with swapping these. Let me just see if I can get this to work. No, it's not going to work. This is actually a video film. I'm going to have a fiddle with the next talk because there's quite a lot of this on it. But what you see here is a very shallow water seamount, and this is just to make the point that seaweeds are also found on seamounts, particularly shallow water seamounts. This is a seamount just to the south of Bermuda. You can see it's entirely covered by a forest of this algae called Spiropnus. And indeed, we found that these were quite rich habitats for a lot of red seaweeds, as well as this species, which completely covered the summit of this seamount at a depth of about 17 meters. Some seamounts also have a lot of rhodolith habitat associated with them as well. So seamounts have been associated with high levels of biodiversity for quite a long time. Some of the first work done on this was done in Australia and New Zealand, and particularly focused on these types of habitats. This is cold water coral reef, formed mainly by the framework building species Solens smilia variabilis. And you can see very typically for these deep water reefs, much of the reef, it comprises dead coral framework with a kind of crust of living coral scattered across it, and then many, many other invertebrates living in and amongst the coral frameworks. And these areas, of course, are also subject to fishing. And indeed, it was some of the work by Richard Bertrand de Forges who first started to look at these habitats. And this from a paper published in 2000, looking at the Southwest Pacific seamounts, where he noted that 297 species of megafauna have been found on 14 seamounts. Of course, it's much more now from what we've heard during this course, of which 16 to 33% were new species, and there was a very low overlap on species present on seamounts, even within the same region. This kind of woke everybody up to the fact that seamounts might be island-like habitats with high levels of endemism associated with them. There was a kind of backlash against this line of thought, which was led up from people from New Zealand and the US, where they looked at seamounts and didn't find these high levels of endemism that were being seen elsewhere in the world. And this is one example, Davidson Seamount in the Northeast Pacific off the coast of California, where Craig McLean and company compared the fauna on the seamounts with the nearby slope. And it's quite a spectacular seamount, lots of spectacular animal communities actually living on it. When they came to look at the kind of composition of those communities, they found that really the percentage of endemics or potential endemics on Davidson Seamount was actually quite low. And they estimated probably around 7%, most of which were sponges and a few others from other groups. Many of the species found on Davidson Seamount were found to have a large geographic range, and were found from a very wide area of the Pacific. And again, many of the species found on the seamount were found on the nearby shelf. But when they actually came to look at the kind of rank order of species within these communities, they found that although there was a strong overlap between the seamount and non-seamount communities, the way these communities were made up was very, very different. So the seamount communities were different in terms of their composition, so the relative abundance of different species to the communities on the nearby shelf. Similar work has also been done down in the southern hemisphere off Australia and New Zealand. And you can see here sampling sites off the Campbell Plateau and to the south of Tasmania on seamounts there. And these again are seamounts which typically have these frameworks of cold water coral associated with them. And what was found here was that biomass was much, much greater on the seamount habitats than on the nearby slopes. And this was mainly a result of these big coral frameworks living on the seamounts, which didn't exist on the slope habitats. So this finding from these studies. Now, the work that had been finding many widespread species on seamounts led, as I said, to this suggestion that endemism, in fact, on seamounts is quite low. And the suggestion that arose from that is that many species found on seamounts have a high dispersal capability and exhibit panmixia in terms of their genetic structure over large geographic scales. And this was almost a kind of negative reaction or counter reaction to the early claims of high endemism on seamounts. And here we're actually showing some more recent work, actually carried out by French researchers, of course, on mollusks from, again, seamounts in this New Caledonia region, Southwest Pacific. And a variety of mollusk species being taken from the Lord Howe Ridge, Norfolk Ridge and slopes of New Caledonia and subject sequencing using mitochondrial and nuclear genes. And what's been found, unsurprisingly, in many ways, is that species which typically have a dispersive life history do seem to exhibit widespread distribution and panmixia in terms of their genotypes across this geographic region, whereas species with much more conservative life histories, so crawl-away larvae or non-planktotrophic development, actually seem to show complexes of cryptic species within this region, much higher levels of local and regional endemism. So I think that this whole story about seamount endemism is actually much more complex than some people would have us believe. And clearly there's much more work that needs to be done to understand the influence of seamounts on endemism within marine taxa. So moving away from kind of general community structure on seamounts, we're going to talk a little bit about why they're such rich biological habitats. And the first theories about this were that seamounts were sites of high primary production. And the way that people first thought this happened was through the development of what are called tailor columns or tailor caps above seamounts. So these are trapped circulations of water, basically caused by the ocean trying to flow past seamount. And you can look at this using theoretical physics. When the water kind of tries to squeeze around a seamount, you get these trapped tailor caps above the seamount. And one of the results of these tailor columns is upwelling of water from deep into shallow water. So it was thought that this basically causes elevated primary production above the seamounts, and this is at least part of the reason why seamount communities are very rich. It also provided an early explanation for potential endemism in seamounts where larvae could potentially be trapped within these closed circulations. However, evidence of enhanced primary production over seamounts as a result of tailor column formation is very rare. At least it's rare to date. And I'll tell you why that is in a minute. Even where enhanced primary production occurs, it's likely to be transported downstream of the seamount, so may not be sort of trapped above the seamount. And also it's likely to be sporadic or seasonal in nature. So you actually struggle to find examples of this in the literature, but they do exist. This is one example in a place called the Northwest Georgia Rise. It's located just off the island of South Georgia, down in the Scotia Sea. Over here is the Falkland Islands. And you can see the Northwest Georgia Rise is this kind of seamount or plateau associated with the northern slopes of South Georgia. And indeed, if you look at this using satellite imaging, ocean color, you do see evidence of more or less permanently enhanced primary production above this feature. So this would seem to be evidence of the formation of perhaps a tailor column above this seamount. This is a much more recent example from DeMark et al. 2020, where they've looked at primary production above seamounts and around islands in the Western Indian Ocean, again using satellite ocean colour mapping. But in this case, they've used a new algorithm to look at primary production at a kind of much finer scale than has previously been done. And indeed, above Walter's Shoal, which is a big seamount south of Madagascar, they do see evidence of a more or less permanent elevation of primary production above part of that seamount. This is seasonal. You'll see it kind of disappears during the summertime and reappears in the, and that's our summertime. Of course, it would be austral winter, and then reappears in the austral summer. So there is some evidence around that, you know, there can be elevated primary production associated with seamounts, and in this case and the previous case, it's been suggested this is due to tailor cap formation. More common feature associated with seamounts are likely to be related to variable flows over seamounts or tidal flows. And here, non-linear interactions between tidal currents and the very steep topography of seamounts can generate a whole range of different oceanographic effects. They can generate sort of toroidal flows around seamounts where you get upwelling, or they can generate closed vertical cells around the seamount where primary production is basically pulled down onto the seamount summit as a result of that cell. This is a really nice picture, actually, we took in the southern Southwest Indian ridge, where you can see this really distinctive internal wave being formed off the top of a seamount. And these variable flows or tidal flows are often associated with tidal amplification, and this can result in the production of these trapped internal waves associated with seamount habitats. And not only are these important in terms of, you know, accelerating current flow over the seamounts, they can, as I said, drag primary production down onto the seamount summit. They can also cause resuspension of organic material from the seafloor as well. And you can see actually there's a nice little shoal of fish sitting there just off the top of this seamount as well. This is a really large feature. It crosses several hundred meters, this wave coming off the seamount. So these are really significant effects. This type of feature is shown here at a much smaller scale over a reef which sits at, I think it's about 150 meters depth off the island of Mingulay in Scotland. And here there's a submerged reef which forms this kind of barrier of elevated seafloor over which the tide flows. And you can see the tidal signal very clearly here in blue. This is in actual current flow, I think. And then that tidal flow superimposed on it is backscatter and fluorescence and water temperature. So you can see through the tidal cycle, we're getting spikes in backscatter and spikes in chlorophyll measurements and so on over this reef. And what's happening here is, again, tidal flow is generating internal waves, so waves between two different water masses associated with this bump on the sea floor. And this is causing downwelling of the surface waters directly onto this reef. So you can see it's literally pulling water down onto the top of the reef, and as a result, pulling phytoplankton and so on down onto the seamount, so acting as a source of food for animals living on that reef. So there are things to do with primary production and kind of delivery of more primary production to the tops of seamounts. But actually, one of the main mechanisms which probably delivers energy to seamount communities is from the deep scattering layer and diurnal vertical migration. So this was first seen during the Challenger expedition, or so UK science historians claim anyway. It occurs in most groups of animals represented in the zooplankton and also the micronecton. So the deep scattering layers contain animals like small fish, lanternfish, large decapod crustacea, cephalopods, and many other types of organisms. This is again a picture, an acoustic picture from the Southwest Indian Ridge, where we can see the micronecton diving from the surface down into deeper waters as the sun comes up in the morning. So it's time along the bottom of this picture effectively, and these animals are migrating from the upper 100 meters down to 400 or 500 meters plus down below. And that was a bit scary. What happens is that essentially the deep scattering layer of the organisms in that layer migrate up to the surface at dusk. They feed in the surface layers of the ocean. They're advected over seamount by currents. And when the sun comes up in the morning and they dive towards the deeper layers in the ocean, the ones that are over the seamount summit and flanked basically get trapped by that elevated topography. This trapping also operates on tropical oceanic islands. We saw it really visibly in Chagos and the Maldives, where if you're down at 400 or 500 meters depth, you can actually see micronectonic animals close to the seafloor during the day, and lots of predators that you typically associate with seamounts feeding on them, including things like benthic ctenophores, which was really interesting. So this phenomena has been looked at in various localities. There was one study done on the Seine seamount in the Northeast Atlantic, and this is the kind of food web that they were looking at. So plankton and micronecton migrating over the seamount, hypothesized to actually be feeding a range of fish associated with the seamount, and those in turn being preyed on by larger predators on the seamount. Strangely enough, though, this study found very little evidence for trophic blockage, and indeed isotopic evidence seemed to support that most of this food web was actually feeding on small zooplanktonic organisms. We think the reason for that is that fishing had already wiped out a lot of the big predators on this seamount. So they were already looking at an ecosystem which is very, very altered from what it would have been in its natural state. These are some pictures from, I think this is Atlantis Bank seamount up in the more tropical waters of the Southwest Indian Ridge. And what you can see here is that basically as the deep scattering layer is moving down to over the seamount, we're getting these big echoes coming off the seamount here. And these are big predators rising off the seamount and just hitting that layer of micronectonic animals. And indeed, when we came to actually put a trawl through these areas, we caught these really amazing seamount predators. Sometimes, in the case of this shark here, you can see its mouth is actually stuffed full of squid, where it's been feeding actually in the net. But certainly when we looked at the stomach contents of particularly these types of animals, Alfonsino, they were packed full of micronectons, so big shrimps, small squids, lanternfish, and so on. And you can see things like these gempiloids are certainly well equipped for predation. Again, typical seamount predators, all of these were caught around these seamounts. We also saw these off Chagos as well. So it seems that this whole idea of topographic blockage and trapping of the micronecton really does hold weight in terms of being an energy source for seamount predators. That's not the whole story of why we find rich communities on seamounts. And talking now more about the invertebrates, of course, animals like corals like hard substrata, and they like rough terrain because it gives an acceleration of ocean currents moving over the terrain, keeps rocky substrates clear of sediment, so it's a nice place for animals like corals to settle, and of course provides them with lots of food and good dispersal of gametes and so on. There's been plenty of work to look at this in various places around the world. This some work that was done by Clark and Rowden on the graveyard seamounts off New Zealand, and essentially they did camera transects running over these seamounts. And what you see is that typically the largest concentrations of corals on the seamounts are located on the seamount summits, and in some cases around the rims of the summits. And that's because those are the areas that are most exposed to currents and where you get most of the rocky substrata and so on. The reason for the big difference between the lower seamounts here and the upper ones is fishing, and we'll come on to that in a moment. This is not a fantastic picture, but what we're doing here now is kind of winding down in scale a bit. And here, this was some early work done on distribution of Lophelia petusa on the Sula Ridge in Norway. And you can probably see what look like almost ripples on the seafloor here on the ridge. What these are actually iceberg plough marks. So they're ancient marks from icebergs which have grounded on this ridge and left these scars. And what happens is when you've got a plough mark, you have these levees and then a trough where the iceberg was grounded. And the Lophelia preferentially colonizes the levees. And then as the colonies grow and they're bio-eroded and so on, they fall into the troughs. And eventually you get a buildup of a coral reef. And in fact, this is the largest Lophelia reef, I think, still known to date. This is a different locality in the northeast Atlantic. This is the Rockall Bank to the west of Britain and Ireland. You can see it here. It's like a giant seamount. In fact, it's a continental fragment, and the Rockall Trough lying to the east. And with the Rockall Bank, there's a kind of band of cold water coral reefs running along the margins at around 600 to 1,000 meters depth. And these cold water coral reefs or carbonate mounds can be up to several hundred meters high. And what you've got in this area are two different water masses. So the I think that's called the East North Atlantic water, ENAW, and Labrador seawater down here in the deep. So obviously warm water overlying very cold. And of course, where we get the corals seems to be in the area where we've got the kind of interface between these two water masses. The lower boundary of the corals seems to be really marked by the kind of thermocline between the Labrador seawater and the East North Atlantic water. Other things are going on here as well. There is a dome of kind of nutrient-rich water over the Rockall Bank, so we do get enhanced primary production over the bank. But what we do particularly get at the depths where the corals occur is a zone of internal wave formation. And indeed, if you look at temperature and salinity and so on, again, there's a really marked tidal signal in these parameters as a result of this internal water formation. And of course, this leads to things like resuspension of organic particles on the sea floor and current acceleration up to about 45 meters per second in the zone where the corals are actually found. Even down to really small scales, small structures on the seafloor can have an important influence on the distribution of corals and other epibenthic attached fauna on the seamount. This is a big lump of basalt on top of, again, I think this is Atlantis seamount. And you can see this really nice growth of coral with lots of these urchins. These are Dermachinus horridus. I always remember that because they really are horrible to pick up, covered in these very sharp spines. And you can see that just the presence of a rock or even a boulder on the seafloor, and if you were down in the Antarctic, that would be a drop stone, probably from an iceberg. You get this rich growth of fauna because, again, it presents hard substrate. You get acceleration of flow of water over the structure and so on, making it favourable for corals to occur. And of course, around here, then you get dead coral framework going, and also, quite remarkably, a habitat formed by the needles on the sea urchins as well. And we notice some animals really like to burrow in these mats of urchin spines. So, because this is a kind of coral workshop, I just thought I'd make the point that we do get lots of corals on seamounts. So I've already talked a lot about big cold water coral reef frameworks, but also we get more isolated colonial corals as well, and solitary corals. I don't really you can make out this cariophylid sitting on the rock there above a very angry looking anglerfish. But they're very good habitats for Scleractinia, and also particularly good habitats for octocorals. Probably one of the most conspicuous groups of organisms on seamounts, and that's both the octocoral groups typically found on hard substrata. See a really lovely corallium colony here, something that looks a bit like Bearagorgia there, but also panachulids, both in kind of more gravelly and soft substrata, but also this group, which have, I don't know whether anyone knows what a Dalek is, but it has a kind of Dalek suction cup for attachment to rocks. So it's quite an interesting group of panachulids. And of course, Antipatheria and Zoantheria as well, which are very common on seamounts, and even Stylastrids. So I thought I'd just finish by saying something about human impacts on seamounts. Of course, since the 1950s, we've seen huge expansion of industrial fishing over the world ocean. And as shallow water fisheries became depleted, or there was a lot of competition for them, fishing has shifted into deeper and deeper water. And you can see that very clearly here in this diagram, which runs from 1950 to 2000 at the top here. And then you can see the depth of fishing increasing beyond 1,000 meters from about 1980 onwards. And this has led to the development of very specialized fisheries targeting seamount ecosystems. And these fisheries are targeting some of these demersal species of fish, which you see around seamounts. This is one of the main targets, orange ruffy. This is one photographed off Atlantis Bank in the southwest Indian Ridge from our ROV. They live for up to 150 or more years long. They don't mature until they're 30 or 40 years old, and they aggregate around seamounts to actually spawn. So it's a species kind of designed to be maximally impacted by any form of intense industrial fishing. And indeed, these species were targeted globally by fisheries from the 1980s onwards around seamounts. And you can see here the type of fishing that goes on. It's trawl fishing, and in particular, it's bottom contact trawl fishing. And the reason for that is that when these fish perceive a threat, they dive for the seabed. And you can actually see this if you've got an echo sounder running and you put a CTD into the water, you can see these fish actually diving for the seafloor when they perceive this thing above them. You can see that why the fishing industry love these fisheries. I mean, they can get really nearly monospecific patches of these shoaling orange roughy as they're gathering to breed around the tops of seamounts. Now, seamounts, as you can imagine, dragging a trawl over a mountain is quite difficult. It really requires precise navigation to go back to what are good trawl lanes on seamounts, and it requires special gear and special techniques to fish. So these nets typically have trawl doors. You can see them here, which are specially shaped so they hold the nets open, but with what they say is minimal contact with the seafloor. And also tow times on these seamounts tend to be very short, as little as 15 minutes for a single tow. These nets are also equipped to really go over very, very rough ground. So you can see the sort of ground gear often includes things like these big rubber wheels to help the nets kind of bounce over obstructions on the seafloor as the trawls are being dragged. Now, it was realised in the early 1990s that this was creating a major conservation issue. These were the first photographs I saw, which woke me up to this, from Tony Coslow working down on seamounts south of Australia, where they were taking photographs of seamounts which had been fished for orange roughy and Oreo, and seamounts which had not been fished. So you see here a kind of typical picture from an unfished seamount, whereas this is a fished seamount, and you can see that the coral framework has just been pretty much obliterated. And indeed, in the early years of these fisheries, what you see is a high bycatch of coral coming up in the trawls, and then as the fishery progresses, that bycatch disappears because the framework has just been destroyed. When you start seeing things like this coming up, you realise that these fisheries are impacting corals which potentially age in the range of thousands of years. Certainly, some of the black corals and octa corals can live for thousands of years, and some deep sea sponges are thought to live for up to 12,000 years for a single colony. This, of course, means very, very slow growth rates and slow rates of recruitment and replacement of populations. So these are all features which are pretty typical of vulnerable marine ecosystems. There's been quite a lot of work done on this, particularly in the Southern Hemisphere. This again takes us back to south of Tasmania, where basically the seabed fauna was compared on seamounts which had never been fished versus seamounts which had been fished and the fishing had stopped versus seamounts where trawling was still happening actively. So what you've got here is never trawled versus trawled, and basically the black bars are corals here, and the obvious thing is that there's a lack of black bars on the trawled seamounts. This is a more obvious way of presenting the data. What we see here is that basically there's no coral cover left on seamounts where the trawling is still active. Very, very little on seamounts where trawling stopped up to a decade before, and then lots of coral cover on seamounts which are never trawled. And then also looking at the kind of reciprocal, which is snapped off stems and broken corals, and of course lots on the trawled seamounts. This leads to big differences in megafaunal density and species diversity on the fish versus unfished seamounts. So you can see here, never trawled, all up here, and then the seamounts which trawled or where trawling has ceased are all down here in terms of species diversity and density. And of course, this is a phenomenon which we've seen all over the globe, where we've seen these seamount fisheries prosecuted. This is a seamount from the Northwest Atlantic, Kukenthal Peak, where there was a Russian trawl fishery. That fishery ceased a number of years before this photograph was taken, but you can see not only the striations from the trawling, which has gone on over this seamount, but the trawling actually busted up the original crust that was on the seamount. So the whole substratum of the sea floor has been altered. This, of course, leads to other issues as well. Fishing gear is often lost on seamounts. So you often see ghost fishing gear left behind on seamounts, trawls, lobster pots, whatever it happens to be. And also lots of litter left behind on the seafloor as well. So beer bottles, bits of engines, fishermen's gloves, all sorts of things. It's not just the hard substrata which are affected by trawling, it's also soft substrates as well. And you can see trawl plough marks here on this photograph. When we were in this area with an ROV, what you did see were lots of sea cucumbers and other animals which had injuries from being hit by trawls. So how are we kind of setting about managing this? Well, it depends where you are in the ocean. Obviously, within the EEZs of countries, it's down to the coastal states' fishing regulations, but in areas beyond national jurisdiction, where many of these seamounts are located, things are a little bit more loose. So photographs from people like Tony Coslow and so on caused an international outcry about the impacts of seamount fisheries in particular. And this resulted in a number of UN General Assembly resolutions, which eventually led to the development of a series of guidelines on management of deep sea bottom fisheries in the high seas. And these guidelines basically asked regional fisheries management organisations to insist on assessments of whether bottom fishing activities impacted VMEs, vulnerable marine ecosystems. If they did, then to manage the fisheries to prevent the damage, to set up protocols for when fishing encountered these types of ecosystems, and to also implement measures to sustainably manage the fish stocks themselves. That all seemed very good and has led to some progress, but what I'm about to show you is an example of why this doesn't work very, very well at the moment. So recently you'll be aware there's been an expedition to the Saya de Malabank by the Monaco Exploration Foundation, part of Prince Albert and Monaco Foundation. And this is a really remarkable place. It's a ginormous seamount. It's covered in one of the largest seagrass beds in the world, and you get these fantastic mixed habitats between seagrass and kind of patches, coral reef, and lots of big animals around in that region. But we don't know much about it. In 2015, the Thai fishing fleet decided to target the Saya de Malabank. And so they turned up with about 56 trawlers and just started to fish the bank. Absolutely no heed to the Regional Fisheries Management Organisation. They didn't bother to join that until 2017. And we think what was going on here was that they just started to fish this feature so they could then lay claim to a fish quota from the Regional Fisheries Management organisation. So this is obviously not a very good situation. So fortunately this year, finally, a new treaty was signed at the UN, Biodiversity Beyond National Jurisdiction Treaty. It's an implementing agreement of the UN Convention on Law of the Sea and is aimed to protect biodiversity on the high seas. And it addresses several major areas. One is environmental impact assessment for industries. The second is spatial conservation measures, and then management of marine genetic resources and benefit sharing. And there's various stipulations in there about capacity building and sharing of research resources. And this treaty is now open for ratification by states. The main thing about this is that for the first time, it has set up a legal framework for protected areas in areas beyond national jurisdiction. The slight fly in the ointment is that for implementation of any of this, the new treaty is going to have to work in cooperation with all of the other UN agencies that are managing things like fishing and mining in areas beyond jurisdiction. So it's going to be an interesting few years seeing what happens when the treaty, say, wants to protect somewhere like the Sao de Mela Bank, putting it in direct conflict with RFMOs, which ultimately answer to the UN FAO in Rome. And of course, there are new threats coming through to seamounts. One of them is deep sea mining. Everyone, or the press at least, tend to focus on manganese nodule mining in the Clarion-Clipperton fracture zone. But of course, seabed massive sulfides and also cobalt crusts, which can both be associated with seamounts, are also targets of this incipient industry. And you can see here where these various mineral resources are actually located. In particular, I point here to the Northwest Pacific, where there are lots of seamounts with cobalt-rich ferromanganese crust. There has been some research done on these cobalt crust communities, and they have been found to be different to the communities on non-cobalt crust areas of the same seamounts. So there's some reason to think that these communities are distinct. And of course, marine mining can potentially come with a large range of impacts, including essentially destruction of the seafloor, everything which lives on it, but also production of sediment plumes, noise pollution, light pollution, and so on, which will affect other elements of seamount communities. So to summarize all that, seamount ecosystems are hotspots of biological activity and biodiversity in the global ocean. They're important ecosystems at a global scale, simply by area, but also because of their substantial impacts on benthic and pelagic ecosystems. And they're under threat from both global and local human activities, especially bottom fishing, but also potentially deep sea mining, and of course climate change as well. So that's it for the first lecture. Might be an idea if we have a little break, because I think we need to fix the videos on the next slide. So next one.
Do you have any questions, Alex?
Yeah.
Thank you for your exciting talk. The subject, I'm a shallow water person. If I followed correctly your talk, you didn't mention global change. The
Yeah.
effect of ocean acidification and temperature rise.
Yeah.
Well, about the temperature, I can live with that. The question about changes in ocean acidification, taking into account the high number of calcifiers in the seabed.
Yeah. Yeah, we specifically modeled this back in 2009, I think, where we actually looked at changes in ocean pH and habitat suitability for cold water corals, Scleractinia specifically on seamounts. And there was certainly a significant impact, or appeared to be, in terms of effects on habitat suitability, and particularly in the North Atlantic, which is one of the kind of centres for distribution for cold water coral reef, habitat. So yes, ocean acidification is definitely a major potential issue. Two other major issues are effects on ocean primary production, which is globally likely to have significant impacts on deep water ecosystems, and also deoxygenation of the ocean as well. And that is potentially a really big one. We're already seeing significant impacts on things like large pelagic fish distribution as a result of changes in oxygenation in the water column. And it's been estimated in the tropical Eastern Atlantic, I think it is, that habitat has been reduced by, I can't remember what the percentage is, but something like 7 or even up to 15%. As a result of deoxygenation, basically pushing those species towards the surface. So global climate change is going to be a significant problem for the deep sea in general, but seamounts as well.
Thank you.
Is it in?
Yeah.
So it should be here.
No, it's in different order. It's this one.
Okay. So we will check if the video is working.
Yeah, it won't be.
There won't be
I don't think so.
because of the computer, I think.
Yeah, and also because we moved computers, so I'll need to relink the videos.
You mentioned the current speed of 45 meters per second. Would it be meters per minute? No, it's per second.
Per second, yeah. We've seen instances where we've had ROVs on seamounts just stuck. It's the strength of the current flow over the sea.
It's hard to fathom.
Yeah.
That's I did a quick calculation on my computer. It's 166 kilometers per hour.
It must be wrong.
Meters,
Yeah, it must be 4.5.
Yeah.
Something like that.
If
I'll need to check that.
if it's per minute, it's 3 kilometers per hour. It's like walking speed.
Okay, it's probably per minute. Then.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's the Teams. It's your right.
It is,
Computers.
Could be to stop it or
The velocity could be down or
Yeah,
feature
also,
of the
yeah,
gas.
and also that